Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, and tonight we turn to a mystery of obscured truth and long-buried secrets. Tell me, can you hear the rain against your window? These are the hours when old depositions speak loudest, when ink-blotted lines demand their reckoning. Watson knew well that the past has a stubborn habit of returning intact, that no secret remains buried forever. Do subscribe so you never miss a careful observation. Now, settle close to the lamp, for as Holmes himself believed, there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify as well. The link awaits you in the description below. Chapter 1. The Solicitor of Wycliffe Square. It was upon a grey afternoon in early November that Mr. Adrian Whittaker first crossed the threshold of our chambers at Baker Street, bringing with him a problem so delicate in its nature that even my friend Sherlock Holmes, who had devoted his singular talents to the unravelling of countless mysteries, confessed himself intrigued from the very first moment of the consultation. I had been standing at the window, watching the yellow fog creep along the street and observing the hurried passage of pedestrians below, when Mrs. Hudson announced our visitor. Holmes, who had spent the better part of the morning in one of those fits of abstraction to which he was occasionally prone, raised his head from the chemical apparatus that littered the table before him and motioned our landlady to admit the gentleman. Mr. Adrian Whittaker proved to be a man of perhaps 45 years, soberly dressed in the manner befitting his profession, which Holmes had already deduced from the particular quality of his black coat and the faint odour of parchment that clung to his person. His face was pale and drawn, and I observed at once the signs of considerable mental agitation. His hands, as he removed his gloves, trembled slightly, and there was in his eyes that hunted look which I had come to associate with those who sought Holmes's assistance in matters of genuine gravity. Holmes waved him to a chair with characteristic economy of gesture. "Pray be seated, Mr. Whittaker," said he. "You are a solicitor of established reputation, practising in the vicinity of Wycliffe Square, I perceive. You have come to consult me upon a matter that concerns a legal document of considerable age, and you are torn between your professional duty and your personal apprehension. I trust I am not far from the mark." Our visitor started visibly, and a faint colour came into his cheeks. "Mr. Holmes," he said with evident wonder, "your reputation does not exaggerate your abilities. I am indeed Adrian Whittaker of Whittaker and Fenimore, and my offices are situated precisely where you have indicated. As to the nature of my business here, you have stated it with remarkable accuracy, though I confess I cannot imagine how you have arrived at such conclusions." Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. "The matter is elementary," he replied, settling into his chair and bringing the tips of his fingers together in that attitude so familiar to me. "Your coat bears upon its sleeve the distinctive chalky residue commonly found in the older chambers of Lincoln's Inn. The edge of your waistcoat shows the impression of a seal, suggesting that you habitually carry documents of legal weight pressed close to your person. The slight discoloration upon your right forefinger indicates prolonged contact with red wax of the quality used for official seals. As to Wycliffe Square, I observed the name of that thoroughfare upon the label attached to your umbrella, which Mrs. Hudson placed in the stand as you entered. The age of the document in question is betrayed by the faint scent of old paper that accompanies you. Quite distinct from the fresh foolscap employed in modern practice, your inner conflict is written plainly in your countenance and manner." "Extraordinary," murmured Whittaker, though the shadow upon his features did not lift. "You have indeed read me like a book, sir. I have come to you because I find myself in a position of the most extreme delicacy, one which affects not only my professional standing, but touches upon matters that have lain buried these 20 years and more." Holmes leaned forward with that sudden intensity that marked his transition from languid observer to eager investigator. "You interest me exceedingly," said he. "Pray proceed with your account, omitting no detail, however trivial it may appear." Whittaker drew from his inner pocket a folded document, which he handled with evident reluctance. As he laid it upon the table between us, I observed that it was a legal paper of some antiquity, the edges yellowed and the folds worn smooth by time. "This," he began, his voice unsteady, "is a deposition relating to an inquest conducted in the year 1873 in the county of Sussex. It came into my possession quite recently under circumstances that I shall explain. The inquest itself concerned the death of a young gentleman named Edwin Mallory, who was found dead at the foot of an old quarry near the village of Ashdown. The official verdict was death by misadventure." "A commonplace enough tragedy," observed Holmes. "Yet I perceive that something in this particular document has disturbed you profoundly." "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. If you will examine the paper, you will observe that several lines of the sworn testimony have been deliberately obscured with ink." Holmes took up the document and carried it to the window, where the fading afternoon light fell upon it more strongly. I joined him there and looked over his shoulder. The deposition was written in the precise legal hand of its era, and the seal at the bottom appeared intact and genuine. But as Whitaker had indicated, there were several lines in the body of the text that had been carefully blotted out with black ink, applied with such thoroughness that no trace of the original writing remained visible. "Curious," murmured Holmes, producing his lens and examining the obliterated passages with minute attention. "The blotting has been performed with considerable skill, using a fine pen and working with the deliberation of one who understood the importance of complete erasure. Yet the seal, as you observe, remains unbroken. This suggests that the alteration was made by someone with legitimate access to the document before it was officially registered." "Precisely my own conclusion," said Whitaker. "But there is more, Mr. Holmes. This deposition should never have been among my firm's archives at all. It relates to an inquest conducted in Sussex, while our practice has always been confined to London. I discovered it quite by chance last week while examining some old files that had been stored in a cabinet unopened for many years." "And what prompted this examination?" asked Holmes sharply. A flush spread across Whitaker's features. "I was seeking certain documents relating to a property matter," he replied, with some hesitation. The cabinet in question had belonged to my late partner's father, who was himself a solicitor of the old school. I had never had occasion to disturb its contents until the present need arose. Holmes returned to his chair, still holding the document, his eyes never leaving our visitor's face. "There is something you have not yet told me," said he quietly. "This paper disturbs you not merely because it is irregular in its presence and in its alteration. You fear something in its implications." Whitaker passed a hand across his brow. "You're right, Mr. Holmes," he admitted. "When I discovered this document, I made certain discreet inquiries. The name Edwin Mallory was unknown to me, but I learned that several persons connected with that old inquest are still living. They reside in various parts of London and the home counties. I thought it my duty to ascertain whether any of them had knowledge of how this deposition came to be in our archives. And what was the result of these inquiries? Each person I approached displayed signs of considerable unease when I mentioned the matter. Colonel Matthew Bryce, a retired officer who now lives in Richmond, became quite agitated and denied any recollection of the affair beyond what appeared in the public record. Mrs. Eliza Fenwick, widow of a magistrate's clerk, refused to receive me. A Mr. Leonard Pike, who was formerly a tutor and now lives in modest circumstances near Clapham, turned pale at the mention of Mallory's name. The Reverend Josiah Trent of St. Albans Parish asked me with great earnestness to let the matter rest. "Their shared anxiety interests me," remarked Holmes. "Pray continue." "It is their very anxiety that has brought me to you, Mr. Holmes. I cannot shake the conviction that this obscure deposition conceals something of significance, something that these people fear to have revealed even after the passage of 2 decades. Yet I am a solicitor, bound by principles of discretion and professional conduct. I cannot pursue this matter openly without risking harm to reputations that may be entirely innocent. At the same time, I feel I cannot simply ignore what I have discovered." Holmes sat silent for a moment, his keen eyes fixed upon the document before him. Then he looked up at our visitor with an expression of quiet resolution. "You were quite right to bring this matter to my attention, Mr. Whitaker," said he. "There is indeed something here that bears investigation. Shared anxiety among persons apparently unconnected is often the surest sign of a shared history, and a history that someone has taken pains to obscure. I shall look into this affair. You may leave the document with me." Whittaker rose, relief evident in his countenance, yet with something of doubt still lingering. "You will be discreet, Mr. Holmes?" "I am always discreet, sir, until the moment when discretion itself becomes complicit in concealing the truth. That is a balance I have learned to judge with some nicety. You may trust me to handle this matter with all proper regard for the innocent." When our visitor had departed, I turned to find Holmes already bent over the mysterious deposition, his lens in hand and that look of intense concentration upon his features that I knew so well. "Well, Watson," said he without looking up, "what do you make of it?" "It appears to be a case of deliberate suppression of evidence," I ventured. "Someone wished to conceal certain testimony relating to this young man's death." "Precisely. But consider, my dear fellow, the curious fact that while the testimony has been obliterated, the document itself has been preserved. Why not destroy it entirely? And why, after lying forgotten for 20 years, should it now inspire such fear in those who remember the original events? There is something here, Watson, that goes deeper than a simple desire for concealment. We are dealing with a secret that time has not diminished, but has perhaps rendered even more dangerous." He laid down his lens and reached for his pipe. "Tomorrow," said he, "we shall begin our inquiries. I think a visit to Wycliffe Square is indicated. There is much that Mr. Whittaker has not told us, and much more that he himself does not yet understand. But the past, Watson, has a curious way of making itself known, however carefully it may have been obscured." The fog had thickened outside our window, and the lamps were being lit along Baker Street. I settled into my chair, conscious that we stood at the threshold of another of those investigations that would test Holmes's remarkable powers to their utmost limit. The case of the obscure deposition had begun. Chapter 2. The Matter of the Blotted Lines. The morning following Mr. Whittaker's visit dawned clear and cold, with that peculiar sharpness in the air that presages the approach of winter. I rose to find Holmes already dressed and standing before the fireplace. The disputed deposition spread upon the mantelpiece where the light from the window fell most advantageously upon it. "Ah, Watson," said he as I entered the sitting-room, "you're in time to observe a most instructive demonstration of the permanence of ink and the folly of those who believe that obliteration equates to erasure." I joined him at the fireplace and saw that he had subjected the document to various chemical tests during the night. Several small bottles and phials stood upon a tray nearby, and there was about the paper a faint odour of reagents. "I have been attempting to recover the obscured text," Holmes explained, "though with limited success. The ink employed was of excellent quality, applied with professional thoroughness. However, certain facts have emerged which are quite as valuable as the words themselves." He took up the document with careful fingers. "Observe, Watson. The deposition concerns the death of Edwin Mallory, aged 26, who fell to his death near a disused quarry in the vicinity of Ashdown, Sussex, on the 14th of August, 1873. The inquest was held 3 days later before the local coroner. The verdict, as Whittaker informed us, was death by misadventure." "A straightforward tragedy, one would suppose," I remarked. "So it appeared to be," said Holmes. "Yet examine the structure of this document more closely. The deposition consists of sworn testimony from one witness, whose name remains visible at the head of the paper. The witness was a Mr. Thomas Hackett, described as a farm labourer residing near the scene of the tragedy. His testimony occupies some 20 lines. Of these, 7 consecutive lines in the central portion have been blotted out with such care that even my most sensitive chemical tests have failed to restore them. Could the obliteration have been performed at the time of the original inquest? An excellent question, and one to which I have devoted considerable thought. Observe the quality of the ink used for the blotting. It is of the same composition as that employed in the original document, suggesting access to the same inkwell or at least to ink of identical manufacture. The pen strokes are consistent with legal practice. Most significantly, the seal at the bottom of the page remains intact, indicating that the alteration was made before the document was officially registered. I examined the seal more closely. It bore the impression of the Sussex coroner's office and appeared entirely genuine. Then whoever performed this obliteration had official sanction. Or the appearance of it, Holmes corrected. But there is more, Watson. Notice the positioning of the obscured lines. They fall precisely in the middle of what must have been Hackett's account of the circumstances surrounding Mallory's fall. The testimony before and after these lines is innocuous enough, describing the witness's movements that day and his discovery of the body. What lies between those points is what someone deemed necessary to conceal. He laid the document aside and turned to face me with that expression of quiet satisfaction that indicated a problem beginning to yield to analysis. Now consider this curious fact, he continued. Mr. Whittaker discovered this deposition among papers that had been undisturbed for many years, yet certain signs suggest that it was refiled only recently. I noted yesterday, though I did not remark upon it at the time, that while our visitor's hands bore the stains of his profession, there was upon his left cuff a smudge of a particular grey dust quite distinct from the ordinary accumulation of a solicitor's office. I confess I observed nothing of the sort. It was faint but unmistakable. That dust, Watson, is characteristic of papers long stored in damp conditions, such as one might find in an old cabinet or cellar. When Whittaker handled the deposition, some of this dust was transferred to his person. Yet the document itself, while aged, shows no signs of such storage. The inference is clear. It was recently removed from one location and placed among Whittaker's files. By whom? That is precisely what we must discover. I propose that we pay a visit to Wycliffe Square this morning. There are questions I wish to put to Mr. Whittaker, and observations I wish to make of his chambers. Within the hour we'd secured a hansom and were rattling through the streets toward our destination. The offices of Whittaker and Fenimore occupied the ground floor of a substantial Georgian building overlooking the square itself. We were admitted by a clerk of middle years, whose expression of habitual composure faltered slightly when Holmes presented his card. "Mr. Whittaker is engaged at present," the clerk informed us, "but if you will wait in the anteroom I shall inform him of your arrival." Holmes, however, had already moved past him into the main corridor, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the establishment. I followed, offering the bewildered clerk an apologetic gesture. The offices were arranged in the traditional manner, with a large outer room where several clerks laboured at high desks, a series of smaller chambers for consultations, and what I took to be the private offices of the partners at the rear of the building. Holmes paused before a particularly heavy oak cabinet that stood against one wall. "This, I think, Safety is the repository in question," said he, running his hand along its edge. "Observe, Watson, the lock has been recently forced or picked. See here, where the metal shows fresh scratches quite distinct from the patina of age, and note the accumulation of dust along the top, undisturbed except at this one corner where someone has recently reached to open the upper door." At this moment Mr. Whittaker emerged from one of the inner rooms. His face brightened at the sight of Holmes, though there remained in his manner something of the anxiety I had noted during his visit to Baker Street. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, this is an unexpected pleasure. I trust you have made progress in the matter we discussed." "I have made certain preliminary observations," Holmes replied. "I should be grateful for your answers to one or two questions. This cabinet, I perceive, contained the document you brought to me yesterday. When precisely was it last opened before your recent discovery?" Whittaker's expression grew troubled. "I cannot say with certainty. As I mentioned, it belonged to my late partner's father, Mr. Edmund Fenimore, who died some 12 years ago. To the best of my knowledge, it has remained locked since that time. I obtained the key from Mrs. Fenimore only last week, when the need arose to locate certain property deeds I believed might be stored there." "And had anyone else access to this key?" "Only Mrs. Fenimore herself, and possibly her son, who occasionally assists with our archives." Holmes nodded thoughtfully and moved to examine the shelves within the cabinet. I saw him pause before one particular shelf, where the dust had been disturbed in a manner quite distinct from the surrounding areas. "This shelf held the deposition," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Yet observe, the dust pattern suggests that only one document was removed from this location, while the surrounding papers remain untouched. Whoever placed it here knew exactly where to find it, and took nothing else." He turned abruptly to Whitaker. "You mentioned making inquiries among those connected with the original inquest. Did you inform any of them that you had discovered this deposition?" "I mentioned only that certain old papers had come to light relating to the Mallory affair. I was deliberately vague as to their nature. Yet each person you approached displayed signs of alarm. Most interesting. Tell me, did you happen to notice whether your firm's ledgers contain any record of business conducted in Sussex during the period in question?" Whitaker considered this. "I had not thought to examine the ledgers. If you wish to see them, they are in the archive room." We were conducted to a small chamber lined with bound volumes, meticulously organised by year. Holmes selected the ledger for 1873 and carried it to a reading desk. I watched as his fingers moved swiftly down the columns of entries, pausing occasionally to make note of some particular transaction. "Here," he said at length, pointing to an entry dated September of that year. "A payment received from Colonel M. Bryce for legal services rendered. The amount is substantial, and the nature of the service is not specified. This entry, you will note, is recorded in a hand different from those surrounding it, and the ink is of a slightly different shade." He looked up at Whitaker with a peculiar intensity. "This entry was added after the fact, was it not?" Our host had grown quite pale. "I cannot say, Mr. Holmes. The hand is not one I recognise, and the practice of that era was less rigorous than our own in matters of documentation. Nevertheless, the inference is suggestive. Someone connected with your firm performed services for Colonel Bryce shortly after the inquest into Mallory's death. Services deemed worthy of substantial compensation, yet too delicate to be described in ordinary business terms." At this juncture, there came an interruption. The clerk who had admitted us appeared at the door, his face flushed with agitation. "Forgive me, Mr. Whitaker," said he, "but there is a gentleman here who insists upon seeing you immediately. He says it concerns a matter of the utmost urgency. Who is it, Perkins?" "A Mr. Leonard Pike, sir." I saw Holmes's expression sharpen with interest, while Whitaker appeared to struggle with some emotion. "Show him to my private office," he said at length. "I shall attend to him directly." But as we moved toward the corridor, Holmes made a casual mention of the name Mallory, in connection with some aspect of the ledger. The effect was remarkable. Perkins, who had been in the act of replacing the ledger upon its shelf, started so violently that the heavy volume slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor with a crash. Whitaker himself turned pale as death, while from the outer office came the sound of hurried footsteps as someone departed precipitately. Holmes picked up the fallen ledger with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Remarkable," said he, "how a name forgotten by the law remains so vivid in memory. Come, Watson, I think we have learned all we need for the present. Mr. Whitaker, I shall call upon you again shortly. In the meantime, I would advise you to take particular care of any documents relating to this matter. The past, I fear, is not yet ready to rest quietly." As we emerged into Wycliffe Square, I turned to my companion with undisguised curiosity. "What do you make of it all, Holmes?" "I make of it, Watson, that we are dealing with something far more complex than a simple administrative irregularity. 3 distinct facts have emerged. First, the deposition was deliberately altered before being officially sealed. Second, it was recently placed among Whitaker's files by someone with knowledge of the firm's archives. Third, the mere mention of Mallory's name produces reactions of guilt and fear among people who should have no cause for either, if the inquest verdict was indeed just." He hailed a passing hansom. "We have stirred a pool that has lain still for 20 years, Watson. I wonder what creatures will rise from its depths." Chapter 3. Death in the Chambers. 2 days passed during which Holmes occupied himself with what he termed the preliminary mapping of the case. He sent numerous telegrams to Sussex, consulted certain records at Somerset House, and disappeared for the better part of one afternoon, returning to Baker Street with mud upon his boots and an expression of grim satisfaction upon his features. When I pressed him as to his activities, he would say only that the ground was being prepared for the final harvest. It was upon the evening of the second day that our landlady brought up a note that had been delivered by special messenger. Holmes read it through twice, his face growing grave, then handed it to me without comment. The message was from Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, and it was brief and urgent in its content. Mr. Adrian Whittaker had been found dead in his private office at Wycliffe Square. The circumstances were such that Lestrade thought Holmes's immediate attendance advisable. Within a quarter of an hour we were in a four-wheeler racing through the darkening streets toward our destination. Holmes sat in silence, his brows drawn together in concentration, his fingers drumming restlessly upon his knee. I knew better than to interrupt these meditations, though my own mind was busy with questions and conjectures. We found Wycliffe Square cordoned off by constables, and a small crowd had gathered despite the lateness of the hour. Lestrade met us at the entrance to the building, his sharp features drawn with concern. "I am glad you have come, Mr. Holmes," said he. "This is a bad business, and there are elements to it that puzzle me considerably." "When was the body discovered?" Holmes asked as we mounted the stairs. "At 4:30 this afternoon by the clerk Perkins, the same man you met during your visit here. Whittaker had been in his office since luncheon, refusing all visitors save 3 whom he admitted personally. Perkins became concerned when Whittaker failed to respond to a knock at the appointed hour for an important consultation. He entered and found him dead." We were shown into Whittaker's private office, a handsomely appointed room lined with legal volumes and lit by a green-shaded lamp upon the desk. The body had not yet been removed. Whittaker lay upon the floor beside his desk, his face turned upward, his features fixed in an expression that might have been surprise or pain. A chair lay overturned near his outstretched hand. Holmes dropped to one knee beside the body, his pocket lens already in his hand. For several minutes he conducted his examination in complete silence, studying the face, the hands, the clothing with that minute attention to detail that characterized all his investigations. Then he turned his attention to the surrounding area, examining the overturned chair, the surface of the desk and the carpet beneath it. "You have formed a preliminary conclusion, Lestrade?" he asked without looking up from his work. "It appears to have been a natural death, Mr. Holmes. Heart failure, most likely. The doctor who examined the body initially thought as much. Whittaker was known to suffer from a weak heart, and there are no marks of violence upon the person. Yet you summoned me, which suggests you harbour doubts." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "There are certain irregularities, sir. The overturned chair, for one thing, and Perkins reports that when he entered the room there was a peculiar odour in the air, though it had largely dissipated by the time I arrived." Holmes rose to his feet and moved to the desk. Upon its surface lay various papers and correspondence, all apparently in order, but I observed that his attention fixed upon a torn envelope that lay half concealed beneath the blotter. "This envelope," said he, holding it to the light. "It has been opened hastily, torn rather than slit with a paper knife. The postmark is from this morning. Where is the letter it contained?" "We have found no letter, Mr. Holmes." "Most suggestive. And these visitors you mentioned, who were they?" Lestrade consulted his notebook. Colonel Matthew Bryce arrived at 2:30 and remained for approximately 20 minutes. He left in what Perkins described as an agitated state. Mr. Leonard Pike arrived some 10 minutes later and stayed for a quarter of an hour. His manner upon departure was, according to the clerk, deeply troubled. Finally, there was a messenger boy who delivered a sealed packet at 20 minutes past 3. He waited for no reply and departed immediately. "And the packet?" "It is here upon the desk, sir, still sealed." Holmes examined the packet. a substantial manila envelope bearing no return address and sealed with plain red wax. He held it up to the lamp, studying it from various angles, but made no move to open it. "We shall leave that for the moment," said he. "Tell me, Lestrade, have you made a thorough search of the room?" "As thorough as seemed warranted for a natural death, sir." "Then perhaps you will permit me to make my own examination." What followed was a demonstration of Holmes's method at its most exacting. He went through every drawer of the desk, examined every book upon the shelves, scrutinised the very wallpaper and wainscoting. I saw him pause before the fireplace, there where the ashes of recently burned papers lay in the grate. He sifted these carefully, extracting several fragments that he placed in an envelope from his pocket. It was when he returned to examine the area immediately surrounding the body that his manner changed. He knelt once more, bringing his face close to the carpet, then to the fabric of Whittaker's coat. He remained thus for several moments before rising abruptly. "Lestrade," said he, "I must ask you to have this room sealed pending a more thorough investigation. I believe you will find, when the post-mortem examination is conducted, that Mr. Whittaker did not die from natural causes." The inspector's eyes widened. "You suspect foul play, Mr. Holmes?" "I more than suspect it. Observe this faint chemical odour that still clings to the deceased's clothing and to the carpet near the desk. It is quite distinct once one knows what to seek. Note also the slight discoloration upon the inner surface of his right hand and the peculiar rigidity of the facial muscles. These are not the signs of simple heart failure." "Good heavens," I exclaimed, "you believe he was poisoned?" "I believe that possibility must be investigated most carefully. But there is something else, Lestrade, something perhaps even more significant than the manner of death." He moved to the cabinet where, during our previous visit, Whittaker had stored the obscure deposition. "The document that brought Mr. Whittaker to consult me has vanished. It is no longer in my possession, for he requested its return yesterday so that he might conduct certain additional researches. I had assumed it would be here, in this cabinet, where he kept all papers relating to sensitive matters, yet the cabinet stands open and empty of all but routine correspondence." Lestrade frowned. "You think the document was taken by one of the visitors?" "That is certainly one possibility. But consider the sequence of events. Whittaker admits 3 callers during the afternoon. One of them, or perhaps more than one, came seeking that deposition. A confrontation occurred, sufficiently violent to overturn this heavy chair. At some point, whether before or after his death, the document was removed from these premises. Then we are dealing with murder, Mr. Holmes? We are dealing with a death that occurred under suspicious circumstances and in connection with a document that someone valued more highly than human life. Whether the death was intended or resulted from misadventure during a struggle, we cannot yet determine. But murder, or manslaughter, the crime is grave enough. Holmes turned to survey the room once more, his sharp features set in lines of concentration. "There is something that troubles me greatly in all this, Watson," said he, as we prepared to depart. "A man facing financial ruin might take his own life. A man threatened with exposure for professional misconduct might flee, or might seek legal counsel. But a man does not struggle desperately to protect a single document relating to an inquest 20 years old, unless that document threatens something more immediate and more terrible than mere historical revelation. What was in those obliterated lines that made them worth killing for?" We descended to the street, leaving Lestrade to secure the scene and arrange for the removal of the body. The night had turned cold, and a thin rain had begun to fall, glistening upon the cobblestones in the lamplight. "Where do we go from here?" I asked. "We must speak with Colonel Bryce and Mr. Pike," Holmes replied. "One of them may have been the last to see Whittaker alive, and one of them may know more than he has yet chosen to reveal. But we must proceed with care, Watson. We are now dealing not with historical curiosity, but with present danger. Someone has already killed to preserve this secret. We must ensure that we do not provide them with further incentive for violence." As our cab rattled through the rainy streets back toward Baker Street, I reflected upon the strange turns this case had taken. What had begun as a puzzle concerning an obscured legal document had transformed into an investigation of murder. Yet I could not escape the conviction that the true mystery still lay buried in those blotted lines, in whatever testimony had been deemed too dangerous to preserve. Holmes sat wrapped in his cloak, his eyes fixed upon something invisible in the darkness beyond the window. I knew that expression well. The game was truly afoot now, and he would not rest until every thread had been followed to its conclusion, no matter how dark the truth might prove to be. The rain fell harder as we approached Baker Street, and with it came the sense that we had crossed some invisible threshold. The past that Whittaker had disturbed was reaching out with deadly intent, and we were now inexorably bound to follow it to whatever end it might lead. Chapter 4. Words carefully avoided. The inquest into Adrian Whittaker's death returned a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. The post-mortem examination had revealed traces of a vegetable alkaloid in the tissues, though the quantity was insufficient to determine with certainty whether the dose had been fatal or merely contributed to a failure of the heart. Holmes received this intelligence with a thin smile of vindication, though I could see that the ambiguity of the medical findings troubled him. "Science has confirmed the fact of poison," said he, "yet leaves us in doubt as to its precise role in the tragedy. A clever murderer might exploit just such an uncertainty, Watson. A man with a weak heart, a dose carefully calculated to strain but not to kill outright, and death might reasonably be attributed to natural causes. Only the theft of the deposition suggests a more sinister design." In the days that followed, Holmes threw himself into the investigation with that intense energy that characterized his pursuit of a complex problem. His first object was to interview those persons whom Whittaker had identified as connected with the original inquest. I accompanied him on these visits, and I confess that I found the experience both illuminating and unsettling. Sir Frore. Our first call was upon Colonel Matthew Bryce at his residence in Richmond. We found him to be a man of perhaps 60 years, upright in bearing despite his age, with the weathered features and clipped manner of speech that marked his military background. He received us in his study, a room dominated by maps and campaign memorabilia, though I noted a certain tension in his welcome. "I have been expecting some such visit," said he, when Holmes had introduced himself and stated the purpose of our call. "The death of poor Whittaker has been much in my thoughts these past days, a dreadful business." "You called upon him on the afternoon of his death," Holmes observed, settling into the chair the Colonel had indicated. "May I ask the nature of your business with him?" Bryce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It was a private matter." "Mr. Holmes, certain financial arrangements that required discussion. Yet Mr. Whittaker's clerk described you as agitated when you departed. The discussion had not gone as I had hoped. These things happen in business." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed upon our host's face. "Colonel Bryce, I must be frank with you. A man has died under circumstances that strongly suggest murder. A document relating to an inquest held 20 years ago has disappeared. That inquest concerned the death of a Mr. Edwin Mallory. I believe these matters are connected, and I believe you possess knowledge that may assist in bringing a murderer to justice." The effect of Mallory's name was immediate and striking. Bryce's face flushed, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair with such force that his knuckles whitened. "That unfortunate business," said he, the words emerging with evident difficulty, "was settled to the satisfaction of all parties at the time. I see no reason to revisit it now. A man is dead, sir. That provides reason enough. Mallory's death was accidental. The inquest determined as much." "I am not speaking of Mallory's death," Holmes said quietly. "I am speaking of Whittaker's." There followed a long silence during which the Colonel appeared to struggle with some internal debate. At length he rose and moved to the window, standing with his back to us. "I cannot help you, Mr. Holmes," said he. "My visit to Whittaker concerned matters that have no bearing upon his death. As to this other affair, it is ancient history, best left undisturbed." Holmes persisted with several more questions. but Bryce had retreated behind a wall of polite refusal. Yet I observed, as we took our leave, that the Colonel's hands trembled as he showed us to the door, and that there was in his eyes a haunted look that spoke of memories imperfectly suppressed. "He is frightened," I remarked, as our hansom carried us toward our next destination. "More than frightened, Watson. He is terrified. Did you note how he referred to Mallory's death as that unfortunate business? The phrase suggests a desire to minimize, to reduce a human tragedy to a mere inconvenience, and observe that he would not speak Mallory's name until I forced it upon him." Our second interview was with Mr. Leonard Pike, whom we found in modest lodgings near Clapham. He proved to be a thin, scholarly man of middle years, shabbily dressed and with the look of one whom life had used hardly. His rooms were crowded with books, and there hung about them the peculiar melancholy of disappointed ambition. Pike received us with nervous courtesy, offering tea which we declined. When Holmes broached the subject of our visit, I saw the colour drain from his face. "I knew this would come," he said, sinking into a chair. "When Whittaker first approached me, I knew that the past would not remain buried." "You visited him on the day of his death," said Holmes. "What passed between you?" Pike pressed his hands to his temples. I begged him to let the matter rest. I told him that there were those who would be ruined by any renewed inquiry into that old affair. He was sympathetic, but he said that he had certain professional obligations that he could not ignore. "Did he show you the deposition?" "He mentioned it, but no, I did not see it. He said only that it raised questions about the testimony given at the original inquest." "Tell me about Edwin Mallory." At this, Pike rose abruptly and moved to the window much as Bryce had done. "Mallory was a young man of considerable promise," said he, his voice scarcely above a whisper. "He had certain expectations regarding an inheritance. There were those who believed he would make something of himself. You knew him well? Well enough. We moved in the same circles at one time. And his death? A tragedy. A senseless accident at that quarry. He'd gone there for some purpose of his own. No one could say why." Holmes allowed a pause to develop, and I saw Pike's reflection in the window glass, his features working with suppressed emotion. "Mr. Pike," said Holmes at length, "you are concealing something. I don't believe you had any hand in Whittaker's death, but I do believe you possess knowledge that may lead to the identification of his killer. Will you not speak plainly?" Pike turned from the window, and I saw that there were tears upon his cheeks. "I cannot," said he. "There are confidences that I am bound to respect, obligations that transcend even the duty to assist justice. I visited Whittaker to plead for discretion. That is all I can tell you. Even though your silence may shield a murderer? Even so." I noted, as Holmes questioned him further, certain peculiarities in Pike's responses, and twice he corrected himself regarding the hour at which Mallory's body had been discovered. When Holmes asked about the precise location of the quarry, Pike claimed uncertainty, yet later mentioned details of the path leading to it. And when the name of Reverend Trent was introduced into the conversation, Pike's reaction was one of unmistakable alarm. "You know Reverend Trent?" Holmes inquired. "I knew him years ago when he was a schoolmaster rather than a clergyman. We have not spoken in many years." "Yet the mention of his name disturbs you." "I am disturbed by this entire affair, Mr. Holmes. The resurrection of old sorrows brings no one peace." We obtained little more from Pike, though Holmes pressed him upon several points of detail. As we departed, I glanced back to see him standing at his window, a figure of such dejection that I felt a pang of sympathy despite my frustration at his refusal to cooperate. Our final call that day was upon Reverend Josiah Trent at St. Albans Parish. We found him to be a man of imposing presence, tall and dignified, with iron-grey hair and the measured manner of one accustomed to moral authority. He received us in his study, a comfortable room lined with theological works and looking out upon the churchyard. When Holmes explained the purpose of our visit, Trent's expression grew grave but composed. "I learned of Mr. Whittaker's death with great sorrow," said he. "He was by all accounts a man of probity and professional distinction. You called upon him recently, I believe, asking that he let certain matters rest." "I did." and I felt it my pastoral duty to counsel against the disturbance of settled affairs. The dead should be permitted their repose, Mr. Holmes, and the living should not be burdened with the sins of the past. You refer to the death of Edwin Mallory? I refer to that unfortunate business, yes. I was present at the inquest. I gave testimony regarding what I had observed. The matter was concluded in accordance with the law and the facts as they were known. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. You arrived at the scene after Mallory's fall, I believe? I did. I was passing nearby when I heard cries for help. I rendered what assistance I could, though the poor young man was beyond all earthly aid. Yet the deposition suggests otherwise. For the first time, Trent's composure faltered, though only for an instant. I cannot speak to what any deposition may or may not suggest, Mr. Holmes. I can only affirm the truth of my own sworn testimony. A testimony that someone deemed necessary to obscure. If that is so, I have no knowledge of it. Holmes rose and I followed his lead, but at the door he turned back. Tell me, Reverend Trent, why do you suppose several persons connected with that long-ago inquest should react with such anxiety when the matter is raised? If the verdict was just and the testimony truthful, what is there to fear? Trent met his gaze steadily. Perhaps they fear not the truth, Mr. Holmes, but the appearance of truth distorted by time and incomplete recollection. A man's reputation, once questioned, is not easily restored, even when suspicion proves unfounded. As we descended the steps of the church, Holmes was silent, wrapped in thought. Only when we had walked some distance did he speak. 3 men, Watson, each of whom refers to Mallory's death in identical terms. Each avoids speaking his name unless forced to do so. Each insists the inquest settle the matter entirely. These are not the words of men recalling a distant tragedy. These are the words of men rehearsing a shared fiction. You believe they conspired to conceal the truth? I believe they share a secret, and that secret has survived 20 years of silence, but now someone has killed to preserve it. The question is which of them, or whether the murderer is someone we have not yet identified. The autumn dusk was gathering as we made our way back to Baker Street, and with it came a sense of gathering shadows over this tangled affair. We had stirred old fears and awakened old guilts, but we were no closer to identifying Whittaker's killer. The words that had been so carefully avoided still held their secret, and the blotted lines remained as obscure as ever. Chapter 5. The Quarry Revisited. It was upon a grey morning 3 days after our interviews with the surviving witnesses that Holmes proposed we should travel to Sussex to examine the scene of Edwin Mallory's death. I confess that I had begun to despair of any progress in the case, for despite Holmes's investigations, we appeared no nearer to identifying Whittaker's murderer or recovering the stolen deposition. We have been examining effects while ignoring causes, Watson, said Holmes, as we settled into our railway carriage at Victoria Station. The death of Whittaker is merely the final consequence of events set in motion 20 years ago. If we are to understand the present crime, we must first comprehend the original tragedy. The journey carried us through the autumn countryside, where the trees stood bare against leaden skies, and the fields lay fallow under a thin mist. Holmes remained largely silent, consulting occasionally a map he'd obtained from the Ordnance Survey and making notes in his pocketbook. I occupied myself with the morning papers, though my thoughts kept returning to the 3 frightened men we'd interviewed, and the secret they so desperately sought to preserve. We alighted at the small station of Ashdown Holt and secured the services of a local trap to convey us to the site of the old quarry. Our driver, a taciturn fellow of advanced years, offered little conversation, though I observed Holmes studying him with that peculiar intensity that suggested he was extracting information from details invisible to the ordinary observer. The quarry itself lay perhaps 2 miles from the village, approached by a narrow lane that wound through scattered woodland. As we drew near, the driver pointed with his whip toward a break in the trees. "That be the place, gentlemen," said he. "Ain't been worked these 30 years or more. Dangerous spot, that. We lost a young fellow there. Oh, Must be 20 years back now. You remember the incident? Holmes asked sharply. Remember it well enough. Great scandal it was at the time, though it all came to naught in the end. Accidental death, the inquest said, and so it were entered in the records. You were acquainted with the deceased? Not to say acquainted, sir, but I seen him about the village. Edwin Mallory, his name were. Had rooms at the George for a time, conducting some business with Colonel Bryce up at the manor. Gentlemanly sort, by all accounts, though there was them as said he asked too many questions. Holmes would have pursued this line of inquiry further, but we had arrived at our destination. The driver indicated he would wait for us at a nearby inn, and we proceeded on foot toward the quarry edge. The site was much as I had imagined it from the descriptions we had gathered. A deep excavation cut into the hillside, its walls of grey stone rising some 40 feet from the floor below, where water had accumulated to form a dark and forbidding pool. The quarry was overgrown with brambles and self-seeded saplings, and there hung about it that atmosphere of abandonment that marks places where human endeavour has been defeated by time and circumstance. Holmes stood at the edge, surveying the scene with his usual methodical thoroughness. He examined the ground, traced the outline of the quarry rim, and consulted his map repeatedly. Then he began to pace along the perimeter, measuring distances with that peculiar loping stride he employed when conducting such investigations. "Come, Watson," said he at length, "let us reconstruct the events of that August afternoon 20 years ago." He led me to a point on the western edge of the quarry, where the ground sloped more gently toward the precipice. According to the inquest testimony, Mallory was found at the base of the cliff, approximately there. He pointed to a spot below us where the rock face met the water. The witnesses stated that he had been walking along this upper path and had evidently strayed too near the edge. A tragic accident, they agreed, though none could say what had brought him to this remote location. "It seems plausible enough," I remarked, studying the treacherous ground. "Does it? Then consider this, my dear fellow. The path that runs past this quarry is a minor byway leading from the village to certain outlying farms. A man on foot would naturally follow it at a safe distance from the quarry edge. Yet Mallory supposedly approached close enough to fall. Why? He moved to the spot where the ground began its steep descent. Observe, Watson. From the path to this point is a distance of some 15 feet across uneven ground thick with gorse and broken stone. A man does not wander such a distance by accident, particularly when the danger is obvious to the eye. Mallory came here deliberately, or he was brought here." Holmes dropped to one knee, examining the ground with his lens, though I doubted that 20 years of weather and growth had left any trace of the original tragedy. "Now consider the testimony of the witnesses," he continued, rising and brushing the earth from his trousers. "Colonel Bryce stated that he was shooting over his land some quarter-mile distant when he heard cries for help. He claims to have arrived here within minutes to find Mallory already dead at the bottom of the quarry. Reverend Trent, then a schoolmaster, testified that he was walking on the road beyond those trees when he too heard shouts and came to investigate. Leonard Pike was said to have been sketching the landscape from a position on the opposite side of the quarry. He gestured toward the far rim. Yet observe the distances involved, Watson. Pike's claimed position is fully 300 yards from this spot across broken ground. The road where Trent says he was walking is screened by dense woodland, and Bryce's shooting grounds are separated from this quarry by a steep ridge. How is it that 3 men, all positioned at considerable distances and in locations that would have obscured both sight and sound, are all managed to arrive here within moments of Mallory's fall? The inconsistency was indeed striking when stated thus plainly. You believe they were already present? I believe they were closer than their testimony suggests, and I believe they were here by design rather than chance. Come, there is something I wish to show you. He led me around the quarry's edge to the northern side where the woodland pressed closer to the rim. Here a second path, much overgrown and barely visible, descended from the direction of higher ground. "This path," said Holmes, tracing its course with his walking stick, "leads directly from the direction of Colonel Bryce's former residence. It would have provided a far more direct route to this quarry than the one he described in his testimony. Why should he claim to have approached from the south when this northern path lay so much nearer to hand? We followed the overgrown track for some distance, Holmes pausing occasionally to examine the surrounding terrain. At length, we emerged onto a slight elevation that commanded a view of both the quarry and the surrounding countryside. "From this vantage point," said Holmes, "one could observe anyone approaching the quarry from the village road. It is in fact an ideal location for a clandestine meeting, being remote yet accessible from multiple directions." He stood in silence for a moment, his eyes scanning the landscape as though he could see through the veil of years to the events that had transpired here. "Let me propose a reconstruction, Watson. The Edwin Mallory discovered something that threatened certain individuals financially or socially. He arranged to meet them here, at this quarry, on that August afternoon. The meeting became confrontational. In the heat of the moment, or perhaps during a physical struggle, Mallory fell to his death. Murder, then? Not necessarily in the legal sense, but certainly a death that occurred during circumstances far removed from the innocent accident described at the inquest. The witnesses conspired to conceal the true nature of the meeting and the events that led to Mallory's fall. The deposition contained testimony that contradicted their agreed-upon version of events. That is why it was obscured. I considered this reconstruction and found it persuasive, yet certain questions remained. But Holmes, if what you say is true, why should these men fear exposure now? 20 years have passed. Surely any legal jeopardy has long since expired. The law may have lost its claim, Watson, but reputation and conscience are not subject to statutes of limitation. A man who has built a respected career, who has attained social standing or spiritual authority, cannot afford to have it known that he participated in suppressing evidence of a death, even an accidental one. The scandal alone would be devastating. He turned from his contemplation of the quarry and faced me directly. But there is something more here, something I have not yet grasped. The reaction of these men suggests not merely embarrassment over an old deception, but genuine terror. They fear not social disgrace, but something more immediate and more dangerous. Someone among them, or connected to them, has already killed to prevent the truth from emerging. Until we understand what truly happened here on that August day, we cannot identify Whittaker's murderer. As we made our way back to where our driver waited, I found myself studying the bleak landscape with new eyes. The quarry that had seemed merely a tragic accident site now appeared as something more sinister, a place where secrets had been born and where, perhaps, they had been violently defended across the span of 2 decades. Holmes walked in silence, his face set in lines of deep concentration. I knew that expression well. The problem was beginning to yield to his analysis, the scattered pieces arranging themselves into a coherent pattern. Yet the final revelation still eluded him, though hidden somewhere in the careful evasions of frightened men and the deliberate obscurity of blotted testimony. The afternoon was fading as our train carried us back toward London. Holmes sat with his eyes closed, his fingers drumming restlessly upon the armrest. I didn't disturb his meditations, knowing that somewhere in that remarkable mind the truth was assembling itself, waiting only for the final piece that would make all clear. "We are close now, Watson," he murmured at last, without opening his eyes. "Very close indeed, but close is not enough when a murderer walks free and justice remains obscured." Chapter 6. The Original Inquest. Upon our return to London, Holmes devoted himself to what he termed the documentary phase of the investigation. He disappeared into Somerset House for the better part of a day, emerging with copies of various records relating to the Mallory inquest. He followed this with visits to newspaper archives, the offices of certain Sussex solicitors, and finally to the Royal Courts of Justice, where he spent an entire afternoon in consultation with documents I was not permitted to examine. I found him late that evening in our sitting room, surrounded by papers arranged in careful stacks upon every available surface. He had removed his coat and collar, and there was about him that air of fierce concentration that indicated he was approaching the resolution of some complex problem. "Ah, Watson," said he, looking up as I entered, "you find me at a critical juncture. I have succeeded in reconstructing the events surrounding Edwin Mallory's death, and I believe I now understand what was concealed in those blotted lines. Pray, take a seat. I should value your opinion on certain points." I settled into my chair, curious to hear what his researches had uncovered. Holmes took up a sheaf of papers and began to pace before the fireplace, a habit he adopted when organising his thoughts for presentation. "Let us begin with Edwin Mallory himself," said he. "He was the nephew and heir presumptive of Sir Richard Mallory, a wealthy landowner with estates in Sussex. Edwin was 26 years old at the time of his death, educated at Cambridge, and by all accounts a young man of intelligence and moral seriousness. In the spring of 1873, he became concerned about certain irregularities in the management of a trust fund established by his uncle for the benefit of local charitable institutions." "What manner of irregularities?" "The trust was administered by a board of 3 trustees, one of whom was Colonel Matthew Bryce. Mallory discovered that substantial sums had been diverted from the intended purposes, and that the accounting records had been falsified to conceal these diversions. He began to investigate, gathering evidence with the intention of exposing the fraud." Holmes paused to consult his notes. The matter was complicated by the fact that one of the other trustees was the late husband of Mrs. Eliza Fenwick, who was then serving as clerk to the local magistrate. Through him, the conspirators had access to legal documents and the means to obscure their activities through official channels. The third trustee had died the previous year, making exposure more difficult to prevent. "And you believe Bryce was responsible for the theft?" "I believe he was the principal actor, yes, though not acting entirely alone. The amounts involved were considerable, sufficient to restore his fortunes after certain unwise speculations had brought him to the brink of ruin. But discovery would have meant not merely financial disgrace, but criminal prosecution. I began to perceive the outlines of the tragedy. Mallory threatened to expose him? More than threatened. He had gathered documentary proof and was preparing to lay the matter before the authorities. But first, it seems, he made the mistake of confronting Bryce directly, demanding restitution and warning him of the consequences of refusal. A meeting was arranged for the 14th of August at the old quarry, a location remote enough to ensure privacy. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the lights of Baker Street below. But Bryce did not come alone to that meeting. He brought with him 2 confederates, Leonard Pike and Josiah Trent, then known as schoolmaster rather than reverend. Pike had been Bryce's secretary during the period when the trust funds were diverted. He had assisted in the falsification of accounts. Whether willingly or under compulsion, I cannot determine. Trent had served as a teacher at a school that received funds from the trust. He too had reason to fear exposure, for he had certified expenditures he knew to be fraudulent. Then all 3 were complicit in the original fraud? To varying degrees, yes. The meeting at the quarry was intended to intimidate Mallory, to persuade him through the presence of multiple witnesses that he was mistaken in his suspicions, or that pursuit of the matter would damage innocent parties. But Mallory was not a man to be easily swayed from what he perceived as his duty. Holmes returned to his chair and sat heavily, his expression grave. What followed can only be reconstructed from the fragmentary evidence that has survived. There was a heated confrontation. Harsh words were exchanged. At some point the confrontation became physical. Whether Mallory was pushed or whether he stumbled during a struggle, he fell from the quarry edge to his death on the rocks below. Good heavens, I breathed. Then it was murder after all. That depends upon one's definition of the term. The law distinguishes between deliberate killing and death resulting from reckless action. I do not believe any of the 3 men intended Mallory's death, but I do believe their actions directly caused it, and I am certain they conspired immediately thereafter to conceal the true circumstances. He took up another document from the table beside him. The inquest was held 3 days later. The 3 conspirators had already agreed upon their testimony. Each would claim to have been at some distance from the quarry when they heard cries. Each would describe arriving to find Mallory already dead, with no indication of how he came to be at the quarry edge. They would suggest he had been walking alone and had ventured too close to the precipice. A tragic accident, nothing more. But surely there was other testimony, other witnesses. There was indeed. A farm labourer named Thomas Hackett had been working in a field that overlooked the quarry from some distance. He saw the confrontation. He saw the struggle. And most damningly, he saw one of the men strike Mallory in a manner that caused him to fall backward toward the edge. Then why was this testimony not acted upon? Holmes's expression grew darker. Because certain influences were brought to bear. Fenwick, the magistrate's clerk, had access to the official records. The deposition containing Hackett's testimony was altered before it could be properly considered, i.e. the crucial lines describing what Hackett had actually witnessed were obliterated with ink. The inquest proceeded on the basis of the conspirators' false testimony, and the verdict of accidental death was duly recorded. And Hackett himself? Why did he not protest? Hackett was a simple man, Watson, uneducated and easily intimidated. I have ascertained that shortly after the inquest, he came into a sum of money sufficient to purchase a small farm in a distant county. He removed there with his family and died some 10 years ago. This source of his sudden prosperity is not recorded, but I think we may guess. I sat in silence, absorbing the full measure of this long-concealed injustice. But Holmes, I said at length, Ma'am, you have not yet identified which of the 3 men actually struck the blow that caused Mallory's fall. Have I not? He fixed me with a penetrating look. The obscure deposition named him specifically, Watson. That is why it was necessary to obliterate those lines, and why, 20 years later, the document's discovery provoked such terror. The man who struck Mallory was Josiah Trent. The clergyman? But surely his position, his reputation. His position and reputation are precisely what he has spent 2 decades protecting. Consider the progression of his life after Mallory's death. Within a year he had abandoned teaching and entered the church. He devoted himself to good works, to pastoral care, to the cultivation of a character beyond reproach. Every action, every sermon, every gesture of piety has been in service to the creation of a persona so virtuous that no one would credit accusations arising from his past. Holmes rose and began to pace once more. But the past is not so easily escaped, Watson. When Whittaker discovered the deposition and began making inquiries, Trent realized that the truth might finally emerge. The blotted lines could potentially be restored through scientific means. Witnesses might be found who remembered Hackett's original testimony. The entire edifice of respectability he had constructed over 20 years might collapse in an instant. So he killed Whittaker to recover the document. I believe so, though proving it will require more than supposition. We must now address ourselves to the evidence that will connect Trent to Whittaker's murder and to the theft of the deposition. He gathered up several of the papers and placed them in a folder. Tomorrow we shall call upon Inspector Lestrade. I have certain information to share with him regarding the movements of our suspects on the day of Whittaker's death. But tonight, Watson, I must pursue one final line of inquiry, one that may provide the conclusive proof we require. What inquiry is that? I must determine whether the deposition itself still exists, and if so, where it might now be concealed. A man who kills to obtain a document does not then destroy it. He hides it, keeps it close, for fear that its destruction might somehow be discovered and used against him. If we can locate that deposition, Watson, we shall have our murderer. The clock upon the mantelpiece struck midnight as Holmes returned to his papers, dismissing me with a gesture to seek my rest. But sleep came slowly that night, for my mind was occupied with the image of 3 frightened men standing at a quarry's edge 20 years ago, watching a young man fall to his death, and then binding themselves through silence to a secret that would ultimately demand yet another life as payment for its preservation. The past, as Holmes had observed, possessed a stubborn habit of returning intact. Edwin Mallory's death had reached across 2 decades to claim Adrian Whittaker, and now it threatened to destroy Reverend Josiah Trent. Justice, though long delayed, was beginning to assert its inexorable claim. Chapter 7. Suspicion Falls. The following morning brought unexpected developments that seemed, at first, to contradict entirely the conclusions Holmes had reached. I was awakened by the sound of urgent voices below, and descended to find Inspector Lestrade in our sitting room, his features animated with an excitement I had rarely seen in that normally phlegmatic official. "Mr. Holmes," said he, scarcely waiting for me to enter before launching into his account, "I believe we have our man. Evidence has come to light that points unmistakably to Leonard Pike as Whittaker's murderer." Holmes, who had been examining a specimen under his microscope, looked up with an expression of polite interest. "Indeed? Pray enlighten us as to the nature of this evidence." Lestrade drew forth his notebook with evident satisfaction. "You will recall that Pike visited Whittaker on the afternoon of his death. We have now obtained testimony from a shopkeeper whose premises overlook the entrance to Whittaker's offices. This witness observed Pike departing at approximately 3 o'clock, and he describes the man's manner as furtive and agitated. More significantly, he noticed that Pike carried something concealed beneath his coat that he had not possessed upon entering." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "Pray continue." "Acting upon this intelligence, we obtained a warrant to search Pike's lodgings. There we discovered, concealed between the pages of a dictionary, a fragment of a legal paper bearing the seal of the Sussex coroner's office." Lestrade produced from his pocket a small evidence envelope, from which he extracted a torn piece of parchment. Holmes took it with care and examined it through his lens. "The document from which this fragment was torn," Lestrade continued, "could very well be the missing deposition. Pike, faced with exposure for his role in the original conspiracy, stole the deposition to prevent the truth from emerging. When Whittaker confronted him, he administered the poison that caused the solicitor's death." "And what does Pike say to these accusations?" Holmes inquired. "He denies everything, of course. Claims he merely visited Whittaker to plead for discretion regarding the old affair. Says he knows nothing of any deposition or fragment. But the evidence speaks plainly, Mr. Holmes. We have him." Holmes rose from his seat and moved to the window, the fragment still held delicately between his fingers. For several moments he stood in contemplation, and I detected in his attitude a certain reservation that puzzled me. "Tell me, Lestrade," said he at length, "what motive do you ascribe to Pike for this murder? Is it not obvious? He participated in the suppression of evidence 20 years ago. The discovery of the deposition threatened to expose his complicity. Rather than face ruin and possible prosecution, he eliminated Whittaker and secured the incriminating document. A plausible theory, yet there are certain difficulties with it." Lestrade's expression grew defensive. "What difficulties? The evidence is clear enough." Holmes turned from the window and regarded the inspector with that peculiar intensity that heralded a demonstration of reasoning. "Consider first the question of means. Pike is a man of limited resources living in modest circumstances. Where would he obtain a rare vegetable alkaloid of the sort that killed Whittaker? The poison employed was not some common substance available from any chemist, but a specialized compound requiring both knowledge and access to acquire. Perhaps he had such knowledge from his earlier career. Pike was a tutor of classical languages and literature, not a naturalist or chemist. But let us proceed to the matter of opportunity. You say Pike was observed leaving Whittaker's offices at 3 o'clock. Yet the medical evidence suggests Whittaker died no earlier than 4 in the afternoon, possibly later. How do you account for this discrepancy?" Lestrade consulted his notes with less assurance. "The time of death cannot be fixed with absolute precision. Perhaps the doctors erred in their estimate. Perhaps. But there is a more fundamental problem with your theory, Lestrade. This fragment of paper you discovered in Pike's rooms, have you examined it closely? It bears the coroner's seal. What more is there to examine?" Holmes handed the fragment back to the inspector. "Observe the quality of the parchment. Note its texture, its weight, the particular shade of the ink employed in the seal. Now consider this." He moved to his desk and extracted from a drawer the notes he had made during our visit to Whittaker's offices. When I examined Whittaker's files, I made detailed observations of various documents, including several that bore the seal of the Sussex coroner's office from approximately the same period. The parchment used in official depositions of that era was of a specific manufacture, heavier than this fragment and with a distinctive watermark visible when held to light. This paper lacks that watermark. Lestrade took the fragment to the window and examined it more carefully. You believe it to be a forgery? I believe it to be a fragment from some other document entirely, one that has been deliberately placed in Pike's possession to incriminate him. Someone wishes us to believe that Pike is the murderer. But who would do such a thing? The actual murderer, of course. Consider the advantages of directing suspicion toward Pike. He is vulnerable, being both poor and already implicated in the original conspiracy. He lacks the resources to mount an effective defence. And his guilty conscience over the events of 20 years ago makes him appear evasive and untrustworthy even when speaking the truth. I had been listening to this exchange with growing comprehension. Then you believe Pike is innocent of Whittaker's murder? I believe the evidence against him has been too conveniently arranged. But let us not rely upon speculation alone. Lestrade, I should like to interview Pike myself, if you will permit it. Within the hour, we had travelled to the police station where Pike was being held. We found him in a state of profound distress, his already thin frame appearing almost skeletal in the harsh light of the interview room. When Holmes and I entered, he looked up with an expression compounded of hope and despair. "Mr. Holmes," said he, his voice breaking, "you must believe me. Hen, I did not kill Whittaker. I could not. I am guilty of many things, of cowardice and complicity in concealing the truth, but not of murder." Holmes took a seat across from him, his manner gentle yet probing. "Tell me exactly what transpired during your visit to Whittaker's office." Pike drew a shaking breath. "I went to beg him, as I told you before. I pleaded with him to destroy the deposition, to let the past remain buried. He was sympathetic but firm. He said that as a solicitor he had certain obligations to the law that he could not ignore even after so many years. We spoke for perhaps a quarter of an hour. He was alive and well when I left him, you must believe me." "At what time did you depart?" "It was shortly before 3 o'clock. I remember hearing the church bells as I walked down the street." "And you took nothing with you from his office?" "Nothing. I swear it upon my soul." Holmes leaned forward. "The fragment of paper found in your rooms. How do you account for it?" "I cannot. I had never seen it before the police produced it. Someone must have placed it there, but I cannot imagine who or why." "You live alone?" "Yes, but my landlady has a key, as does the building superintendent. Anyone might have gained access during my absence." Holmes rose and began to pace the small room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Pike, I must ask you a question of some delicacy. At the quarry, 20 years ago, who struck the blow that caused Edwin Mallory to fall?" Pike's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he would refuse to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. It was Trent, Josiah Trent. Mallory was denouncing us, calling us thieves and frauds. Trent lost his temper and struck him. It was not a heavy blow, more a push than a strike. But Mallory was standing too near the edge. He stumbled backward and fell. It happened so quickly. We stood there in horror, unable to believe what had occurred. And then you conspired to conceal the truth. Yes, God help us. Yes. Bryce said that nothing we could do would bring Mallory back, that exposing the truth would only destroy 3 more lives without purpose. Trent was beside himself, shaking and weeping. I was too frightened to think clearly. Bryce arranged everything. The false testimony, the alteration of the deposition, the payment to the witness, and we were bound together by our shared guilt. Holmes nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Pike. It does you credit, however belatedly offered." When we had emerged once more into the corridor, Lestrade regarded Holmes with evident frustration. His confession to the original conspiracy does not exonerate him of Whittaker's murder. "No," Holmes agreed. but the evidence against him is far from conclusive. Consider, Lestrade, that Pike freely admitted his role in concealing Mallory's death. Would a man who had just committed murder to hide that very crime then volunteer a confession to it? The psychology is inconsistent. Then you believe him innocent? I believe the case against him has been constructed to deceive us. Someone has attempted to use Pike as a convenient scapegoat, or knowing that his poverty and past guilt would make him an easy target for suspicion. As we descended the steps to the street, I ventured a question that had been troubling me. Holmes, if Pike did not kill Whittaker, then who did? The same man who killed Edwin Mallory, Watson. The same man who has lived these 20 years in fear that his secret would emerge. The same man who now seeks to protect himself by directing our attention toward a false suspect. Reverend Trent. Precisely. But suspicion is not proof, and I must confess that thus far we lack the evidence necessary to bring him to justice. He is clever, Watson, and he has had 20 years to perfect his defences. We must proceed with the utmost care. The afternoon had grown cold, and a thin rain had begun to fall as we made our way back to Baker Street. I found myself reflecting upon the ease with which suspicion could be manipulated. How a few planted fragments could create a compelling illusion of guilt. Pike, already burdened by his conscience and his poverty, had been selected as the perfect vessel for false accusation. Yet Holmes had seen through the deception with that uncanny ability that marked all his greatest investigations. The obvious criminal, as he had once remarked, rarely committed the subtle crime, and in Reverend Josiah Trent we faced an opponent whose subtlety was matched only by his desperation. Chapter 8. The Failed Explanation. The next morning brought an unexpected caller to our chambers. I was engaged in reading the newspaper account of Pike's arrest when Mrs. Hudson announced that the man himself had been released, and now waited below. "You're requesting an audience with Holmes." We found him in our sitting room, standing uncertainly near the door as though unsure of his welcome. He appeared even more haggard than when we had seen him at the police station, but there was in his eyes a glimmer of something that might have been gratitude. "Mr. Holmes," said he, advancing with tentative steps, "I understand from Inspector Lestrade that I owe my release to your intervention. The charges have been dropped, though I am told I must remain available for further questioning." "Pray be seated, Mr. Pike," Holmes replied, gesturing to a chair. "You are under no obligation to speak with me, but if you are willing, there are certain points I should like to clarify." Pike sank into the offered chair with evident relief. "I will tell you anything you wish to know. I have lived too long with deception, Mr. Holmes. Whatever consequences may follow, I am done with lies." Holmes settled into his own chair, his fingers forming that characteristic steeple. "When you visited Whittaker on the afternoon of his death, did you see the deposition?" "No, he spoke of it, said that it raised troubling questions, but he did not show it to me. I sensed he was torn between his professional duty and his natural compassion. He was not an unkind man." "Did he mention any other visitors he was expecting that day?" "He did not, though as I was leaving, his clerk mentioned that someone had sent word requesting an urgent consultation. I heard no name." Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest. "You heard this from the clerk directly?" "Yes, from Perkins. He seemed troubled by something, though he would not say what. Most illuminating. Now tell me, Mr. Pike, in your observation of Whittaker during that interview, did he appear to be in good health?" "Certainly. He was pale as befitted a man dealing with such a delicate matter, but there was no indication of illness or distress beyond the mental strain of the situation." Holmes rose and moved to his desk, from which he extracted several documents. "I must now demonstrate to you why I was certain of your innocence, Mr. Pike. The case against you, though superficially compelling, collapses upon rigorous examination." He spread the documents before us. "First, consider the matter of access and opportunity. You departed Whittaker's offices at 3 o'clock. Multiple witnesses confirm this timing. Yet Whittaker was seen alive and in apparent good health by his clerk as late as 3:30, when Perkins brought him tea. The poison that killed him required time to take effect, and the medical evidence suggests death occurred no earlier than 4 o'clock. You could not have administered a slow-acting poison and departed a full hour before its effects became apparent. Pike's expression showed his dawning comprehension, but the police seemed certain of my guilt. The police were deceived by the careful arrangement of false evidence. Consider next the fragment of paper discovered in your rooms. I have examined it closely and determined that it is not, as claimed, a piece of the deposition. The paper stock is wrong, the seal impression inconsistent with authentic documents from that period. It was planted in your lodgings to incriminate you. I could not restrain my curiosity. But Holmes, how did you determine the paper was false? By comparison with authentic samples, Watson. During our visit to Whittaker's offices, I made certain observations that proved invaluable. The genuine depositions from the 1870s were prepared on paper manufactured by Belmont and Sons, a firm that supplied the Sussex courts. That particular paper bore a distinctive watermark, a crowned lion, visible when held to light. The fragment supposedly found in Pike's rooms lacks this watermark entirely. He took up another document. Furthermore, I conducted an experiment yesterday evening. I obtained samples of the ink used in official seals during that period and compared them with the ink on the fragment. The composition differs markedly. Modern ink, Watson, contains aniline dyes that were not commercially available in 1873. The seal on this fragment was created recently, not 20 years ago. Pike stared at the documents with an expression of wonder. Then someone went to considerable trouble to implicate me falsely. Indeed they did, but their very thoroughness betrayed them. A genuine fragment of the deposition, hastily torn and concealed, would have shown signs of age, of handling, of the particular deterioration that affects old paper. This fragment is too pristine, too carefully prepared. It is a fabrication designed to deceive a cursory examination, but not sustained scrutiny. Holmes returned to his chair. There is also the matter of your physical capacity for the crime. The chair found overturned in Whittaker's office was a substantial piece of furniture, oak construction, weighing perhaps 40 pounds. The medical examiner noted that Whittaker's body showed signs of having struggled, suggesting that the chair was knocked over during some physical confrontation. Yet you, Mr. Pike, suffer from a chronic weakness of the left shoulder, do you not? Pike touched his shoulder unconsciously. An old injury from my university days. How did you know? I observed during our previous interviews that you favour your right side exclusively, that you never raise your left arm above shoulder height, and that you flinch slightly when turning in that direction. A man with such an impairment could not have engaged in the sort of violent struggle that the physical evidence suggests. I found myself marvelling once again at Holmes's extraordinary powers of observation. Then the true murderer must possess considerable physical strength, I ventured. Or desperation sufficient to overcome natural limitations, Holmes replied. Fear and guilt are powerful motivators, Watson. They can drive a man to acts he would not otherwise contemplate. He turned his attention back to Pike. There is one final point that convinced me of your innocence. When I interviewed you at your lodgings, I observed certain books upon your shelves relating to natural philosophy and botany. You possess a modest library on such subjects, suggesting an amateur's interest in the natural sciences. It has been a hobby of mine for many years. Precisely. Yet among those books I noted no volumes dealing with toxicology, no works describing the properties and effects of vegetable alkaloids. A man planning to commit murder by poison would surely have acquired such references. Their absence suggested to me that you lacked both the knowledge and the intent to employ such methods. Pike's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Holmes, I cannot adequately express my gratitude. To have been believed, to have my truthfulness credited when all the evidence seemed against me, it is more than I dared hope. Holmes waved away these expressions with characteristic brusqueness. Truth requires no gratitude, Mr. Pike. It simply requires recognition. Now, I must ask you to consider carefully your answer to my next question. During the 20 years since Mallory's death, have you had any contact with Reverend Trent? Pike's face grew troubled. Very little. We have encountered each other on perhaps 3 or 4 occasions at public functions. Each time he has been scrupulously polite but distant. It was as though we had agreed by unspoken consent to pretend we were mere acquaintances rather than men bound by a shared and terrible secret. And in those encounters, did he ever speak of the past? Never directly. But once, perhaps 5 years ago, I attended a sermon he delivered on the subject of conscience and redemption. His text was from the Gospel of Matthew, "For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, and hid that shall not be known." I remember feeling that he was speaking directly to me, warning me to remain silent. A curious text for a man harbouring such a secret to choose, Holmes observed. I thought so at the time, but Trent has always possessed a certain boldness in his hypocrisy. He constructs virtue from the very materials of his guilt. Holmes rose, indicating that the interview had concluded. "Mr. Pike, I must ask you to remain in London for the present. Events are approaching their culmination, and I may require your testimony when the time comes to confront the true murderer." After Pike had departed, I turned to Holmes with mounting excitement. "You intend to accuse Trent directly?" "I intend to prove his guilt beyond all possibility of doubt. But proof requires evidence, Watson, and evidence requires method. We have established that Pike is innocent, that the fragment was planted, that the true murderer possesses both physical strength and access to rare poisons. We know that Trent struck the blow that killed Mallory 20 years ago, and that he has spent the intervening years constructing an edifice of respectability to conceal his past. We know he had motive and opportunity to kill Whittaker, but we do not yet have the final, irrefutable proof that will convince a jury. What manner of proof do you seek?" Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the grey London afternoon. "The deposition itself, Watson. The original document, with its blotted lines and its terrible testimony. Trent took it from Whittaker's office. Of that I am certain. But he did not destroy it. Men who kill to obtain something do not then casually discard it. He keeps it hidden, perhaps as insurance, perhaps from some perverse desire to possess the evidence of his crimes. If we can locate that document, we shall have him. But where would he conceal it? That is the question I must answer, and answer quickly, for with each passing day Trent's confidence grows. He believes himself safe, believes that the false evidence against Pike has diverted suspicion. But his very confidence may prove his undoing. A man who feels secure becomes careless, and carelessness, Watson, is the criminal's inevitable betrayal." The afternoon waned toward evening, and Holmes sat in brooding silence, his pipe sending up clouds of smoke as he pondered the problem. I knew better than to disturb these meditations, for somewhere in that remarkable brain the final pieces were falling into place, and the solution assembling itself from the scattered fragments of evidence and deduction. The case against Reverend Josiah Trent was building, but the structure remained incomplete. One more stone was needed to complete the arch, one final proof that would bring the entire edifice of his guilt into clear and undeniable view. Chapter 9. The True Meaning of the Deposition. It was upon a dreary November evening, with rain lashing against the windows of our Baker Street chambers, that Holmes finally declared himself ready to bring the case to its conclusion. He had spent the intervening days in a flurry of activity that took him to various quarters of London, though he remained characteristically reticent about the precise nature of his investigations. "The time has come, Watson," said he, looking up from a telegram he had just received, "as just to assemble our dramatis personae and reveal the truth of this tragic affair. I have asked Inspector Lestrade to join us, along with Colonel Bryce, Mr. Pike and Reverend Trent. They should arrive within the hour. You have discovered the deposition? I have discovered something rather more valuable, the means by which the deposition may be recovered and the murderer unmasked. But all must be done with the proper formality. This is not merely a matter of private satisfaction, Watson. A man stands accused of murder, and justice demands that the truth be established beyond all reasonable doubt." As the appointed hour approached, our guests began to arrive. Colonel Bryce came first, his military bearing unable to conceal the anxiety in his features. Pike followed shortly after, accompanied by Lestrade, whose expression betrayed both curiosity and professional scepticism. Last to arrive was Reverend Trent, who entered with the composed dignity that characterised all his public appearances. Holmes had arranged chairs in a semicircle before the fireplace, and he invited each man to be seated. I observed how carefully he had positioned them, Trent between Bryce and Pike, as though to prevent any private communication among the conspirators. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, standing before the mantelpiece with his hands clasped behind his back, "I have asked you here this evening to resolve a mystery that has its roots in events that occurred 20 years ago, but which has recently manifested itself in murder. I refer, of course, to the death of Edwin Mallory in 1873, and the death of Adrian Whittaker earlier this month." Trent shifted in his chair but maintained his expression of polite attention. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I fail to see what possible connection these tragic events might have to one another, or why you should require our presence to discuss them." "The connection will become apparent shortly, Reverend Trent, but let me begin by reconstructing the events of that August day 2 decades past." Holmes proceeded to recount the story of Mallory's discovery of the trust fund fraud, the confrontation at the quarry, and the conspiracy to suppress the truth. As he spoke, I watched the faces of the 3 men. Bryce grew increasingly pale. Pike bowed his head in evident shame, but Trent's features remained impassive, revealing nothing. "The key to understanding both deaths," Holmes continued, lies in a single document, the deposition of Thomas Hackett, the farm labourer who witnessed Mallory's fall. That deposition was deliberately altered before being filed with the official records of the inquest. Several lines of testimony were obscured with ink, rendering them illegible. He paused, allowing his words to settle upon the assembly. "The question that has driven this entire investigation is, what did those blotted lines contain? What testimony was deemed so dangerous that it required obliteration, even at the risk of criminal prosecution for tampering with official documents?" Lestrade leaned forward with evident interest. "And you have determined the answer, Mr. Holmes?" "I have. Though I could not restore the original text through chemical means, I was able to locate a copy of Hackett's preliminary statement, given to the local constable before the formal inquest. That statement, fortunately, was preserved in the constabulary archives in Sussex, where it escaped the notice of those who sought to suppress the truth." Holmes drew from his pocket a folded document, which he held up for all to see. "This statement makes clear what the altered deposition concealed. Thomas Hackett witnessed the entire confrontation at the quarry. He saw 3 men meet with Edwin Mallory. He heard angry words exchanged, and most significantly he saw one of those men strike Mallory with sufficient force to cause him to stumble backward over the edge of the quarry. The tension in the room had become palpable. Trent's composure had begun to crack, though he maintained his silence. The blotted lines," Holmes continued, "name the man who struck that blow. They identified him as Josiah Trent, then a schoolmaster at the local academy, now a respected clergyman of the Church of England." Trent rose abruptly from his chair. "This is an outrage, sir. I will not sit here and listen to such accusations. That young man's death was a terrible accident, nothing more. The inquest determined as much." "Sit down, Reverend Trent," Holmes said quietly, and there was in his voice such authority that Trent sank back into his seat. "The inquest determined what you and your confederates wished it to determine, but the truth has a stubborn habit of surviving, even when buried beneath lies and obscured ink." Holmes moved to stand directly before Trent. "When Adrian Whittaker discovered the altered deposition among his firm's archives and began making inquiries, you realised that the truth might finally emerge. You could not risk exposure, not after 20 years of constructing a reputation for moral rectitude, not when revelation would destroy everything you had built from the ashes of your crime." "You cannot prove any of this," Trent said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Can I not? Let me present the evidence against you, Reverend Trent, point by point. First, you visited Whittaker on the afternoon of his death. You have not denied this." "I visited him, yes, but I left him alive and well." "You visited him, and you engaged in a confrontation that resulted in his death. The evidence is quite clear. You employed a rare vegetable alkaloid, likely obtained through your connections with missionaries who have served in tropical regions where such substances are known. I have verified that you correspond regularly with the Church Missionary Society and have received various botanical specimens from their workers abroad. Trent's face had grown ashen. Second, Holmes continued, you possess specific knowledge that only the murderer could have. During our conversation at your study, you referred to the deposition as having been destroyed before I had ever mentioned its disappearance. How could you know it was missing unless you yourself had taken it? I saw Lestrade make a note in his pocketbook, his expression now one of grim satisfaction. Third, there is the matter of language. When you wrote a letter to Whittaker requesting the urgent consultation that brought you to his office that fatal afternoon, you employed a particular legal phrase in the matter of said deposition, a phrase that appears in the obscured document itself. This same phrase appeared in the forged fragment planted in Pike's rooms. Only someone who had read the original deposition would have known to use such archaic legal terminology. Holmes moved to his desk and retrieved a small vial. Fourth, I conducted a chemical analysis of the cleaning solution used in your study, Reverend Trent. It contains traces of the same alkaloid found in Whittaker's tissues. You attempted to clean the implement you used to administer the poison, but chemistry is an exacting science. Traces remain. Trent's hands gripped the arms of his chair with such force that his knuckles whitened. Finally, and most damningly, there is your own psychological betrayal. You have spent 20 years constructing an elaborate persona of virtue, yet that very elaboration has been your undoing. Your sermons on confession and redemption, your ostentatious charity, your cultivation of moral authority, all of it has been in service to a single purpose, to create a character so apparently virtuous that no one would credit accusations of murder. Holmes's voice grew softer but more penetrating. But you could not escape your own conscience, could you, Reverend Trent? That sermon Mr. Pike recalled, the one about secrets being revealed, that was not a warning to him. It was your own terror finding voice, your fear that the past would indeed return to claim you. The silence that followed was profound. Trent sat motionless, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then, slowly, his shoulders sagged and his head bowed. It was an accident, he whispered. Both times, accidents. Mallory was threatening us with ruin, with prosecution. I only meant to push him away, to silence his accusations for a moment. I never intended for him to fall. And Whittaker, he would not listen to reason. He spoke of duty, of justice, of the need for truth. I tried to make him understand that exposing the past would serve no purpose, would only destroy lives without bringing Mallory back. When he refused, when he threatened to take the matter to the authorities, I acted without thinking. The poison was meant only to make him ill, to give me time to secure the deposition. I did not know his heart was weak. I did not intend his death. Yet you did nothing to save him, Holmes said. You watched him die. Alt took the deposition from his office, and then attempted to direct suspicion toward an innocent man. These are not the actions of one who kills by accident, Reverend Trent. These are the calculated acts of a murderer. Lestrade rose and moved toward Trent. Reverend Josiah Trent, I am arresting you for the willful murder of Adrian Whittaker. I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence against you. Trent made no resistance as the handcuffs were placed upon his wrists. He looked up at Holmes with an expression of utter defeat. Where is the deposition? He asked. I must know. Where did you find it? Holmes regarded him with something that might have been pity. I did not find it, Reverend Trent. I deduced where you must have hidden it. A man of your profession would naturally choose a place of sanctity, a place where your frequent presence would arouse no suspicion. The deposition is concealed somewhere within St. Albans Church, is it not? Most likely in your private vestry, among the parish records where only you would have occasion to search. Trent closed his eyes. behind the panel that holds the communion vessels. I could not bring myself to destroy it. I thought perhaps one day I might make my peace, might confess and accept my punishment. But I was too much a coward. As Lestrade led him away, accompanied by the constables who had been waiting below, Holmes turned to the remaining men. "Colonel Bryce, Mr. Pike, you're both guilty of conspiracy to suppress evidence and of perjury at the original inquest. However, the passage of time and the fact that you did not directly cause Mallory's death may serve to mitigate your culpability. That determination must rest with the courts." The two men departed in silence, their faces bearing the weight of shame and approaching judgment. When we were alone once more, I turned to Holmes with undisguised admiration. "A masterful demonstration, Holmes. But tell me, how did you know about the phrase 'in the matter of said deposition'?" "I did not know with certainty, Watson, but I observed that Trent's education was classical and legal in nature. Such men develop habitual patterns of language. When I saw the same archaic phrasing in the letter requesting the consultation, and in the forged fragment, I recognized the signature of a particular mind. The rest was logical inference." He moved to his chair and settled into it with evident satisfaction. "The obscured deposition proved in the end that no secret is ever truly buried, Watson. It may be hidden, obscured, suppressed for a time, but truth has its own weight and its own insistence. Edwin Mallory's death reached across 20 years to claim justice, delayed but not denied." The rain continued to fall outside our window, washing the streets clean, and I found myself reflecting that perhaps there was in nature itself a kind of justice, that even the most carefully concealed crimes would eventually be brought to light, revealed by the persistent accumulation of evidence and the inexorable logic of deduction. Chapter 10. The Weight of Old Truths. The trial of Reverend Josiah Trent occupied the better part of a week in the following January, and provided the newspapers with abundant material for sensational reporting. The revelation that a respected clergyman had murdered to conceal a 20-year-old crime captured the public imagination in a manner that Holmes found distasteful but unsurprising. I attended each day of the proceedings, though Holmes appeared only when called to give his testimony. He delivered his evidence with characteristic precision, eschewing dramatic flourish in favour of methodical presentation of facts. The jury required less than 2 hours to return a verdict of guilty, and Trent was sentenced to death, though this was later commuted to life imprisonment owing to certain mitigating circumstances and the intervention of influential members of the church. Colonel Bryce and Leonard Pike were tried separately for their roles in the original conspiracy. The Crown, recognising the passage of time and the fact that neither man had directly caused Mallory's death, elected to pursue charges of perjury and obstruction of justice rather than accessory to manslaughter. Bryce received a sentence of 18 months' imprisonment, while Pike, whose cooperation with the investigation was taken into account, was bound over with a severe reprimand and a substantial fine. It was upon a cold February afternoon, some weeks after these proceedings had concluded, that I found Holmes in his usual chair, smoking his pipe and gazing into the fire with that abstracted expression I knew so well. The case had been closed, justice had been served, yet I sensed in him a certain dissatisfaction that transcended the mere resolution of a puzzle. "You're troubled, Holmes," I ventured, settling into my own chair. He turned to me with a faint smile. "Not troubled, Watson, but reflective. This case has raised certain questions that extend beyond the immediate facts of crime and punishment." "What manner of questions?" He drew thoughtfully upon his pipe before responding. "Consider the nature of justice in this affair. Edwin Mallory died 20 years ago, the victim of a crime that went unpunished because those responsible conspired to conceal the truth. Now, 2 decades later, 3 men have been brought to account for their actions. But what has been achieved, really? Mallory remains dead. Whitaker, an innocent man who stumbled upon an old secret, is also dead. And Trent will spend the remainder of his life in prison. Bryce's reputation is destroyed, and Pike is ruined financially. Where, in all this accumulation of tragedy, does justice truly reside? I considered his words carefully before replying. Surely justice resides in the fact that the truth has been established and the guilty punished. Perhaps. Yet I cannot help but observe that the punishment falls most heavily upon those least responsible. Pike was a weak man who allowed himself to be drawn into conspiracy through fear and dependence upon Bryce. He has spent 20 years in poverty and obscurity, and now faces complete destitution. Bryce was motivated by financial desperation and made a terrible choice, but he did not strike the blow that killed Mallory. Only Trent is truly guilty of deliberate violence, aligned both 20 years ago and in the recent murder of Whittaker. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the grey London afternoon. There is another aspect of this case that merits reflection, Watson. The deposition that proved so central to our investigation was discovered purely by chance. Had Whittaker not needed to search that old cabinet, had he selected a different file to examine, the document might have remained concealed for another 20 years, or forever. The machinery of justice, we like to believe, operates with systematic efficiency. Yet how often does it depend upon accident and happenstance? Are you suggesting that justice is merely a matter of chance? I am suggesting that justice delayed is justice compromised. A false record is a crime against time itself, Watson. When truth is obscured, whether through deliberate falsification or through the passage of years, the possibility of genuine justice diminishes. We can punish the guilty, yes, but we cannot restore the dead or undo the consequences of long-buried crimes. He returned to his chair and fixed me with a penetrating look. Consider what we have learned about the three men who stood at that quarry edge 20 years ago. Bryce was a man of some distinction, who made unwise financial decisions and compounded them with crime. Pike was a talented educator whose career was ruined by his association with Bryce's fraud. And Trent was a young man who struck out in anger and then spent 2 decades attempting to atone through good works and religious devotion. You sound almost sympathetic to them. I am sympathetic to the waste of human potential, Watson. That is quite different from excusing their crimes. Trent's charitable works, however genuine they may have appeared, were built upon a foundation of murder and deception. Good acts do not cancel evil ones. They merely make the accounting more complex. Holmes paused to relight his pipe, and in the flare of the match I saw his features set in lines of contemplation. Yet, I find myself wondering whether Trent's years of pastoral service brought genuine comfort to those he aided. Can virtue performed from guilty motives still benefit its recipients? If a man builds a hospital to expiate his crimes, are the patients treated there any less healed? These are questions that extend beyond the realm of criminal investigation into the domain of moral philosophy. You have always maintained that your concern is with facts. Ye are not ethics, I observed, and so it remains. But facts, when properly examined, often illuminate ethical questions whether we wish them to or not. The fact is that Trent killed 2 men across a span of 20 years. The fact is also that during those same years, he performed numerous acts of kindness and service. Both facts are true. Both must be considered in any complete understanding of the case. I found myself thinking of our encounter with Trent at St. Albans Church, of the dignity and composure he had displayed, of the carefully constructed persona of moral authority that had concealed such terrible secrets. Do you believe his remorse was genuine? I asked. Holmes considered this. I believe his fear was genuine, and fear often masquerades as remorse. But yes, Watson, I think there was true regret in the man. His choice of that particular biblical text for his sermon, "Nothing covered that shall not be revealed," suggests a mind tormented by the inevitability of exposure. He knew, on some level, that the past would eventually demand its accounting, and yet he killed again to prevent that accounting, indeed, which proves that remorse without courage is merely another form of self-pity. True repentance would have required confession, acceptance of punishment, restitution to the extent possible. Instead, Trent chose to protect his reputation at the cost of another life. That choice defines him more surely than any amount of charitable works. The fire crackled softly in the grate, and outside the window the February dusk was gathering. I thought of Edwin Mallory, a young man I had never known, whose death had set in motion a chain of events that had reached across 2 decades to claim fresh victims. What became of the original Deposition, I asked. It was retrieved from Trent's vestry and is now properly filed with the official records of the Inquest. The blotted lines have been annotated with the text of Hackett's preliminary statement, so that anyone examining the record will understand both what was concealed and why. The truth is now complete and accessible, though it comes too late to serve any practical purpose. Surely it serves the purpose of historical accuracy. Perhaps. Though I wonder if future historians, examining that corrected record, will fully comprehend the human cost of its correction. They will see the facts, but will they understand the fear and desperation that led to the original obscuration? Will they appreciate that the revelation of those blotted lines cost Adrian Whittaker his life? Holmes fell silent, and I sensed that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Yet one question remained that I felt compelled to ask. Do you believe, Holmes, that the truth is always worth pursuing regardless of the cost? He looked at me with an expression of profound seriousness. That is the question that haunts every investigator, Watson. I can only say that the alternative, allowing falsehood to stand unchallenged, permitting the guilty to escape justice through the passage of time, seems to me even more intolerable. Truth may be painful, its revelation may cause suffering, but it possesses an inherent value that transcends immediate consequences. He rose and moved to his desk, where he took up a folder containing his notes on the case. I shall preserve these documents, Watson, along with the account you will undoubtedly write of this affair. Let them stand as a reminder that the past is never truly past, that secrets have weight and persistence, and that justice, however delayed, retains its claim upon the living. In the weeks that followed, the case of the obscure Deposition receded from public attention, displaced by fresh scandals and newer sensations. But for those of us who'd been intimately involved in its resolution, it remained a touchstone, an exemplar of certain truths about crime and consequence that no amount of time could diminish. I learned that Mrs. Eliza Fenwick, the widow of the magistrate's clerk who had facilitated the original conspiracy, had died quietly in her home, and her role in the affair having been established but deemed insufficient for prosecution, owing to her advanced age and infirmity. Colonel Bryce served his sentence with dignity, and upon his release retired to the continent, where he lived out his remaining years in obscurity. Leonard Pike disappeared from London entirely, and despite my inquiries, I could discover nothing of his subsequent fate. As for Holmes, he added the case to that mental archive of criminal investigation that informed all his subsequent work. Occasionally, when confronted with some particularly puzzling problem, I would observe him pause and murmur something about obscured depositions and the stubbornness of buried truth, and I would know that his mind had returned to that November evening when justice had finally claimed its long-delayed victory. The obscure Deposition itself, properly restored and annotated, remains in the Sussex archives to this day. I have often thought that it stands as a fitting monument not merely to Edwin Mallory, whose death it documented, but to the principle that no secret, however carefully concealed, is ever truly safe from the persistent inquiry of those committed to uncovering truth. For as Holmes observed on that cold February afternoon, a false record is indeed a crime against time itself, and time, like my friend Sherlock Holmes, possesses a remarkable capacity for patience and an even more remarkable capacity for revelation. The past, we learned, has a stubborn habit of returning intact, demanding that old truths be acknowledged and old debts be paid no matter how many years have passed since the original crime was committed. And thus concluded the case of the obscure Deposition, another chapter in that long chronicle of investigation and deduction that it has been my privilege to record. It stands as a reminder that justice, though it may be delayed, denied, or obscured, ultimately asserts its claim upon the guilty, and that truth, once established, cannot be erased by any amount of ink or time.